My name is Luke Etchison, and I'm the Western Region Aquatic Wildlife Diversity Coordinator for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. Today I'm going to talk about Sicklefin Redhorse restoration in the Little Tennessee and Hiwassee River basins. Sicklefin Redhorse are an undescribed species that was discovered by science in the early 1990s. However, the Cherokee Indians have considered it a distinct species for centuries. The Cherokee people even have a unique word for Sicklefin Redhorse, which translates to "where's a red feather." Sicklefin, among other sucker species, were an important part of the Cherokee diet, and you can still find old fish collection weirs in the Little Tennessee River in North Carolina. After the species was discovered, basic research by Dr. Bob Jenkins started in 1994 and lasted for about 10 years into the mid-90s. Some key goals during this time were to understand the meristics and morphology of Sicklefin Redhorse so they're easier to identify, understand the spawning requirements, distribution, seasonal movement, and if they were declining or not. And if they were, they'd understand what to do next. So Sicklefin Redhorse are a distinct species with an iconic sickle-like dorsal fin and a red caudal fin. They're well suited to moderate gradient streams in the Little Tennessee and Hiwassee River basins, and they can grow to 25 inches long. They also have a fairly predictable spawning run that they go on every spring. Around the time Dr. Jenkins' research was slowing down, the Wildlife Resources Commission and other conservation partners in Western North Carolina started working on a long-term plan for conserving the species. In 2005, they were declared a candidate for federal listing because of their unique endemism and their small range. The Center for Biological Diversity petitioned Fish and Wildlife Service to make a listing decision. A species status assessment was conducted in November 2014, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that a listing was not warranted. However, the state of North Carolina labeled them as threatened. Sicklefin Redhorse candidate conservation agreement was signed in December 2015 to try and formalize a partnership for conserving the species. This formal partnership brought together stakeholders and conservation partners in Western North Carolina and North Georgia to help conserve this species before it was too late. There are 6 main partners that signed on initially to this candidate conservation agreement. This includes Wildlife Resources Commission, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Georgia DNR, Tennessee Valley Authority, Duke Energy, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. So there are 3 main goals for conserving Sicklefin Redhorse, or a 3-step process for conserving them. And this is true for most species. You need to understand where they occur, what their population numbers are like, and what limits the population growth and expansion. And if you can understand that, you can find ways to overcome it. So the Sicklefin Redhorse are found mostly in Western North Carolina and parts of North Georgia. The areas in green are considered the current Hug 12 watersheds that they are found. The areas in yellow are areas that could potentially be reintroduced, and both colors together make up pretty close to what we consider the historical range of the species. So through Dr. Jenkins' basic research, we understood where they occur. The next step is trying to understand what their population numbers are like. So populations for any fish species can be difficult, and there are many ways to do it. Mark recapture studies are a proven effective way to estimate fish populations, and that's what we try to do for this species. However, it's not as easy as it sounds. One of the issues is it's ongoing. You basically need a long-term monitoring to understand what the population's doing. And it can take many years to find meaningful results. So there are also some sampling challenges which make it difficult to estimate these populations. The Little Tennessee River Basin and Hiwassee River Basin are two very different systems and require two different methods of Sicklefin Redhorse collection. The Little Tennessee River Basin is made of mostly large and wide rivers. It makes it easy for us to use a boat electrofishing setup. And that is by far the most effective way to sample in deeper water. The Hiwassee River Basin, however, is fairly narrow and made of mostly shallow rivers. It makes it difficult to float a boat, and so other methods need to be used. We use what's called a fyke net, which is basically a trap net in the middle of the river that has wings that guide fish as they're traveling upstream into a trap. Once they're collected in the trap, we go in there, we count them, we measure them, we tag them, and we let them loose upstream. So two very different methods, but they both are pretty effective for their given system. There are also some other sampling challenges. Early on, folks didn't know when the spawning season was and whether you should sample during the spawning season or not. So when these fish are out of spawning season, they're basically found in deeper water. And this also leads to some lower densities that you can find them. So they spread out, they're in deeper water, and it's just a lot more difficult to get very many. So really the best method is to sample for them during the spawning season, especially if you're wanting to retrieve eggs and milk for hatchery propagation. In the spawning season, there are higher densities, but timing is difficult to predict. Temperature-dependent spawning runs are when we're collecting. So if the temperature of the water is not at the right temperature, they won't start their spawning run. So it's really tricky to try and predict when it's going to be in the correct temperature ranges, especially with our spring rain that we get in Western North Carolina. There's also some difficulty with sampling them during the spawning season because some of these areas are really rocky and shoaly habitats, and it makes it difficult, especially for the boat, to get in these areas safely. So here is a preliminary figure of some of the population estimates we have for the Little Tennessee River Basin. The main thing I want to get across is that between the two systems, the Little Tennessee River and the Tuckasegee River, which are the two main rivers in the Little Tennessee River Basin, you can see that there are fairly high population estimates for these areas, considering, and they vary year to year. The big picture take-home message for this figure is that it varies year to year. It seems to be somewhat stable. The Little Tennessee River population seems to be a little bit stronger than the Tuckasegee River. And then there are more males in the system than females, which is something that's common in other sucker species. So it's somewhat what we expected. But the main take-home point is they're stable. So now we can focus on some other things like how do we expand the population. So we understand where they occur. We understand roughly what their population numbers are like. And now we can start focusing on what limits population growth and expansion. So going back to the range of the species, you can see all the areas in yellow are areas that the species used to occur. So early work has been done in the Oconaluftee, and the Tuckasegee and Little Tennessee River systems. And much of the work trying to reintroduce them in the Oconaluftee River has been unsuccessful. But one thing you can get just by looking at this map of the entire range is everything that limits the population starts with a dam being in the way. So if you don't have the ability to remove these dams, you can start reintroducing above these dams. There are issues associated with stocking up in these areas, but it's one of those things where you can't really know how it'll work until you do it. So one of our major objectives of the Sicklefin CCA is to establish sustainable additional populations, one in the Hiwassee and one in the Little Tennessee River Basin. If we could do more than one, that would be icing on the cake. And by adding these additional populations, it basically just lowers the probability of extirpation and extinction. And this is why reintroductions are a major goal of our aquatic wildlife diversity program. So currently the Oconaluftee River is an area that Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians is the lead manager on, and they've been reintroducing them for several years there now. And our hope is to eventually start trying to reintroduce them in the upper Little Tennessee River and the Nottoway River. The other watersheds are potential options down the road, but for right now, we're trying to focus on the highest priority watersheds. Since the Nottoway River watershed is primarily in Georgia, they have the lead on the reintroduction in that watershed and the population estimates for the Hiwassee River Basin. So far, since conservations have come together working on Sicklefin Redhorse, there's been a lot of success. They've stocked greater than 50,000 Sicklefin Redhorse fry into the Oconaluftee River on the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Reservation, and they've also stocked in the Tuckasegee River. There's been some evidence of success, but we are still working on trying to evaluate the success of these stocking events. We'd also like to continue some of the new areas, including the upper Little Tennessee and the Nottoway watersheds in these two river basins. With that, feel free to send me any questions at luke.etchison@ncwildlife.org. Thank you.